This screencast is about how can a population become sustainable. Now, a sustainable population is one whose growth and development is at a rate that does not threaten the success of future generations. Countries at stage 4 of the demographic transition model with low birth rates and death rates are the most sustainable. The economy is stable or grown and the standard of living is maintained or improving. Stage 5 populations, on the other hand, are not sustainable because numbers are decreasing. In Japan, there were calculations done that predicted how long it would take the country to die out if current low birth rates continued well into the future. Although it is highly unlikely to happen, the fact that it was even thought about was worrying. Now, this screencast is mainly going to be about the China one-child policy, and as you can see on the diagram here, we're going to be looking at the reasons for the one-child policy that came into place in China from 1979. We're going to look at the severity of the rules imposed under the one-child policy and how the one-child policy has changed over recent years and the outcomes of these changes. So, as we've seen previously, China is at stage 3 on the demographic transition model. And during the 1970s, the Chinese government realised that the country was heading for famine unless severe changes were made quickly. This was due to the high birth rate and the reduced death rate. Changes to the industrial economy at the expense of farming had already caused a catastrophic famine from 1959 to 1969, with 35 million deaths. After that, a baby boom followed, so the population was grown too fast to be sustainable, and so the government decided that they had to step in to avoid another crisis. However, a lot of people have kind of seen what China have done and considered it to be too strict and even cruel in some cases. Beginning in 1979, the one-child policy said that each Chinese couple, weren't allowed to marry until their late 20s. They were only allowed one successful pregnancy. After the first child, they had to be sterilised, or they would have to abort any future pregnancies. If they did only have one child, they got benefits, so they received a 5 to 10% salary rise, so the amount of money that they earned went up for limiting the family to one child. They would have priority over housing, on pensions, on family benefits, and that included having free education for the single child that they had. However, if you disobeyed what the government was saying and had a second child, you actually got a 10% salary cut, so you lost money. You got a fine, and that it would often bankrupt a lot of people and households. The family would have to pay for the education of both children and for the healthcare of the family that you would have got free if you'd only had one. And the second child born abroad, although it wasn't penalised, wasn't allowed to become a Chinese citizen. Now, one of the things that the government did, not just give pay cuts to the actual people, but they actually give pay cuts to the other people who worked with somebody. So that pressure, so they would obviously stop people from having two children, but add pressure to the family, meaning that they wouldn't have a second child. That's something called the granny police, which were older women of the community who were entrusted with the task of keeping everyone in line. So it was their job to make sure that people who were able to have children didn't have more than one, and that they kept the contraception appointments that they'd arranged. China is a racially mixed country. It has over 80% of the population of the Han race. Minority groups could become sustainable under the one-child policies, so they were exempt. They were one of the people who were allowed to have more than one child because they were worried that they might no longer exist if they were only allowed one child. In rural areas where sons are essential to work the family land, a second pregnancy was allowed, particularly if the first one was a girl. Now, as you can tell, the one-child policy was very strict, and it's caused a lot of problems in some cases, and a lot of controversy. Some women were forced to have abortions as late as 9 months of pregnancy if it was their second child. Women were placed under tremendous pressure from the families, from the workmates, from these granny police, and their own consciences and feelings. Local officials and central government had power over private lives. Again, people's lives weren't their own. They had to kind of fit in with what the government was saying. They weren't allowed just to have as many children as they wanted. Because Chinese society prefers sons over daughters, a lot of girls were placed in orphanages. Sometimes female children were actually allowed to die, known as female infanticide, in the hope that the second time they had a pregnancy that they might actually have a boy. The Chinese children also have a reputation have been overindulged. As you can see in this photograph here, about one child, because they had one child, they were spoilt. And so they often had this name as being little emperors. Now, China's one-child policy has brought important benefits to the country as well. The famine that had been previously forecast hasn't happened. Population growth has slowed down, as can be seen on this graph. So in the 1979-78, you kind of had a natural increase of 1.2%. That rose up to kind of 1988-ish, up to about 1.7. And then, as you can see, since then, the impact of the one-child policy has been to reduce that natural increase. So in 2011, it was actually about 0.4%. In total, it's been estimated that actually 400 million fewer people have actually been born in China as a result of this one-child policy. Increased technology and exploitation of resources have increased standard of living for many, so people have better standard of living now. New industries have lifted millions out of poverty. This is partly the result of the one-child policy, but new technology from other countries has also helped. Obviously, over time, there's been changes to the one-child policy. In particular, in the 1990s and the year 2000s, young couples who were both only children themselves, so single children, actually allowed 2 children. But government officials are expected to set an example by only having 1 single child. As people have become wealthy in China, some are choosing to have larger families and simply just pay the fines. If they want 2 children, 3 children, they're just having it, and they are paying the fines that they're given by the governments. Couples no longer need to obtain permission for a first child now. The Shanghai government is considering introducing incentives to encourage couples to have 2 children in that area. And it is now illegal to discriminate against women who give birth to baby girls, and has prohibited sex-selective abortions. So previously they would have, if they'd found out they were having a girl, they often had abortions. That's now been made illegal. In 2008, following a devastating earthquake that killed lots of children, the policy was relaxed in the Sichuan province where that earthquake actually happened. As I said, we've looked at kind of the consequences of the one-child policy. With less time needed for childcare, women have been able to concentrate on having a career. Again, they weren't allowed to marry to the late 20s, so those women in China have kind of focused on having a career, getting their education and so on. The policy will not change until at least 2015. In 2008, China still had 1 million more births than deaths every 5 weeks, and half the population lived on less than $2 a day. So there's still a need to do something about the population increase. And finally, with boys being favoured rather than girls, China has a serious gender imbalance. There are now 60 million more young men than young women. And of course that has knock-on effects. When those men are looking for wives, there's more competition, there's less people out there to kind of get married to. And obviously they're not going to affect, they're not getting married, again, less children being born. So, overall, the one-child policy in China has tried to make the population in China sustainable. But as you'll hopefully have realised, it's had lots of positive effects, but also lots and lots of very negative effects. And it's up to you to kind of decide whether you believe that's a good thing or not.